Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many people here tonight in this lovely weather that we're having outside. It truly is one of the most exciting experiences for me. I'm John Rotenberg, and I'm treasurer of the Robert F. Kennedy Action Corps, and I've been a member of the board for almost 24 years. And one of the things that I have always fought for was to have a symposium of this nature. We are one of the largest child care agencies within the Commonwealth. We service around 700 children. We have 10 programs throughout the state dealing with troubled children. And rather than having a fancy 25th anniversary party with champagne and caviar and all those great things you do on the 25th anniversary, we decided that rather than having a fundraiser, which I know my family's happy that we aren't, but to have a symposium, to talk about the future. Because, see, we've been in business for a little over 25 years, and we've been dealing with children. We don't have all the answers. Now, I'm not sure who does, but we thought it'd be a great idea to jointly work with the Kennedy School of Government to have this symposium, to talk about the future of children, what will happen in the next 25 years. And so I'm happy that the Kennedy School of Government allowed us to do this with them. And being the treasurer of the Robert F. Kennedy Action Corps, I think where I always come from is I like to be very happy and thankful for the great friends of ours from the Mellon Bank and the Boston Company, because they helped to underwrite this event tonight, and we want to thank them. They did a wonderful job, and we appreciate it. And if anybody has some big deposits they want to send over the Mellon Bank or the Boston Company, we'd be very happy for you to do that. So maybe next year we'll have a bigger symposium. I'd like to say that when I set this thing up with Jennifer Phillips, who does such a wonderful job at the Action Corps, with Ed Kelly, who's our executive director, and I must say to you that there's no finer executive director in any program than Ed Kelly. We really want to thank you, Ed. He does a great job for us. And as a man who I used to work for, Tip O'Neill, he would say, and you got to say the guy lives in Cambridge, and he still does. So when you talk about at Harvard that you really have someone from Cambridge working in the program of child care, he stayed in Cambridge and he works with the kids, and we really want to thank you, Ed. We're fortunate to have this symposium here today. And I think that the moderator has an exciting job to do. She is head of the Malcolm Weiner Institute here at the Kennedy School of Government. Her name is Julie Boatwright Wilson, and I love that name because I sell boats, and having a name like Boatwright, it must mean that she has something to do with boats somewhere in her background. I think Julie has an exciting program to talk about because we had a dinner earlier, and we have various spectrums of the political scale at the symposium here tonight. And it was fascinating to listen to. And if you're a parent, this is a topic that I guarantee you'll think about tonight when you go to sleep. Ms. Wilson, thank you.
Welcome to the ARCO Forum and to what promises to be an incredibly lively discussion about the future of children and families. I'm going to start by setting the stage just a bit and laying out a vignette of a type of family that needs support from the community and from many sources. Move on to introduce all the panelists at the same time so that I don't have to interrupt their talks, and then we're going to let them get started with their presentations. The question is, what is the situation going to be like for children and families after the year 2000? And what role do families, communities, state governments, local governments, the federal government, the private sector, the nonprofit sector have to play to support children and families? Well, let's start with the basics. By the year 2000, we estimate that there will be about 70 million children under 18 in this country. That, by anybody's count, is a lot of kids. Ironically, however, as the number of children increases, their political clout is probably decreasing for two main reasons. First, children are making up a smaller share of the population. At the peak of the baby boom, 1 out of 3 of us was under 18. By the year 2000, it's going to be less than 1 in 4. And they're going to be in fewer households because households are unbundling and spreading out. We're hearing this in the primary in New Hampshire. If you've been following the news, if you heard the reports on NPR this morning, you heard the fellow say, "I'm 85. Why should I be paying school taxes? I don't have any children in school." Because an increasing number of households have no children. Second, it's not just the demography that's changing, but it's what Ramphele talks about as the pictography of our children that's changing. In the year 2000, more than a third of these 70 million children will be Hispanic, Asian, African American, Indian. But what about the voters? More than 70% of the voting age population will be non-Hispanic white, and many more than 80% of the over 65 population will be non-Hispanic white, and they vote in large numbers. So even pictorially, the children look different than the voters. The children aren't in the homes of the voters. That's the first change. Second, the resources that families have for their children are declining. Yes, poverty is one measure. And yes, we know that some families are remarkably well off, but more than 1 in 5 children lives in a household with an income below poverty. And that's likely to increase. And the reason it's likely to increase is that an increasing number of our children are spending at least part of their childhood in a single-parent family, a family that has fewer workers to put into the labor force to provide the financial resources that a family needs. More than half of the children will spend at least part of their time living with only one parent, and more than 1 in 3 children is born into a single-parent household, the child of a never-married mother. These children are more likely to be financially poor than their peers, but they also don't have the emotional, the spiritual, and the guiding resources of 2 parents to draw on as they grow up. The third major change that I see is that the communities in which children live have changed enormously. We have spread out. We are no longer highly concentrated in cities. Many of our children are growing up in the most remarkable environments in the world. Good schools, a wealth of after-school and weekend opportunities, safe streets, and all the opportunities and resources that a well-off family can provide. But there are other children who aren't growing up in neighborhoods like that. And interestingly, the children growing up in the well-off neighborhoods don't know and don't see the other children because they're in different schools, because they live among different networks. These other children who are living in depressed rural areas or in the depressed areas of our center cities are living in neighborhoods where the schools aren't very good, where the streets are very dangerous, where there might be some activities provided at a neighborhood center or through the church, but where there aren't a lot of parents out there organizing Little League and soccer and football games, and where the families don't have the resources to supplement what the city and the neighborhood doesn't provide. These are 3 major trends that we have to come to grips with. We've heard these statistics. The most dire have been bandied about in the debate on welfare reform and child welfare policy in Washington. And we've seen the poignant stories of the most vulnerable and the most needy of our families. I want to end my initial remarks with a vignette about a different type of family, not the type of family that's suffering from severe abuse, extreme poverty, but a family that's right on the margin, a family that I'm calling the Swanson family. It's mother, father, and 4 children. The father is an independent contractor, the mother an assistant in a doctor's office. He has a high school degree. She's taken a number of science courses at the local community college. Both are in and out of work depending on the state of the economy. They own a home in a town with reasonably good schools. They have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of whom are of above average intelligence. But all suffer from learning disabilities, and all suffer from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. 2 of the children are supposed to be taking medication on a regular basis, but don't. One adolescent daughter has been hospitalized for eating disorders. This family belongs to a church which it attends irregularly, and a non-church-based religious organization in which it's very active. The children participate in various activities in school. Their grades are erratic, and there are some behavior problems. When both parents are working, when the children are in school, and when things are moving along on a schedule, the family functions well. But when one or more parent is out of work, when the children are home for the summer, when a crisis is emerging, the family doesn't function well. The parents respond to this by saying, I know we should do this, I know my child should do X or Y or Z, but what can you do? The Swanson family is not unusual. They're on the margin. But they work hard. The parents love their children. They want to do the best for their children. They don't abuse them. They don't neglect them. But life is stressful. The parents are worried, and the children are on the edge of not making it through adolescence. These are families for whom we don't currently provide many services. If you don't beat your children, if you aren't eligible for welfare, we don't have the network that comes out to help you. We're dependent on the local communities. And it seems to me as our labor market changes, as the economy changes, as family structure changes, it's families like the Swanson family that we need to worry about, as well as those families that are more desperate. We have assembled a remarkable panel of people to worry about these families today. And our thanks go to the RFK Action Corps for assembling them. I could actually spend the entire forum telling you about their accomplishments, but I won't. I'm going to briefly introduce them, but to tell you that this is a panel that is outstanding, and in the words of Garrison Keillor, all above average. I want to give you one quick statistic. I just did a little calculation, and the average number of children of people on this panel is 3.4. For those of you who follow statistics, you know, way above average. There is one outlier in the group that boosted the average here. Let me just go down the line. David Lederman has been Chief Executive Officer of the Child Welfare League of America since 1984. The Child Welfare League is the oldest and largest voluntary organization in North America concerned with developing and improving services to abused, neglected, and deprived children and their families. Mr. Lederman has had a varied career. He began his career as a youth worker in public housing in the Boston area. He entered politics and served 2 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, in which capacity he was selected as one of the 50 outstanding legislators in the United States by the Eagleton Institute. He left the legislature to become the first commissioner for the Office for Children in Massachusetts. So he's seen it from the government, from the executive, from the legislative, from the nonprofit side. He's looked at these problems and the programs. Charlie Baker is currently Secretary of Administration and Finance for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In this capacity, he serves as the governor's chief advisor on fiscal matters, as well as exercising administrative and fiscal oversight on the state's budgetary and personnel and other matters. We were just asking him a few questions. He's got all those numbers at his fingertips. Prior to this, he was Secretary of the Executive Office of Health and Human Services for the Commonwealth, where he was responsible for managing the 16 agencies that address the health, income support, and social welfare needs of the state's families and children. David Elwood is Academic Dean of the Kennedy School and Malcolm Weiner Professor of Public Policy. He recently returned to the Kennedy School from a stint in Washington, D.C., where he served as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In this capacity, he served as Secretary Shalala's Principal Advisor for the Formulation and Analysis of Policy. He was co-chair of President Clinton's Working Group on Welfare reform, family support, and independence, and was one of the principal architects of the President's Work and Responsibility Act of 1994, better known as the Clinton Welfare Reform Proposal. He has a PhD in economics and has written extensively on poverty and welfare. And Patrick Fagan is the William H.G. Fitzgerald Senior Fellow, did I get that? In Family and Cultural Issues at the Heritage Foundation. In this capacity, he examines social trends that have negatively affected American society, focusing heavily on what's happened to the family in this country. He has spent a lot of time looking at issues like reforming the foster care system, looking at adoption programs, looking at the relationship between family structure and crime. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Bush administration, where he again focused on family, community, and long-term care issues. He's a psychologist who was educated in Ireland. He brings a multicultural perspective to us.
Thanks, Julie. And my thanks, too, to John and Ed Kelly at the RFK Children's Action Corps. Not only for putting this on, but for all the great work that you guys do every day, helping lots and lots of kids in the greater Boston area, which we are grateful for. There's a big shift going on in this country, no secret to anyone in this room, right? And I think what's happening because of the shift is it's putting enormous pressure on those of us charged with the responsibility of helping the most vulnerable among us, particularly vulnerable children and families. There's a great debate going on in Washington, debate about balancing the budget, about what kind of welfare reform, which is really not welfare reform, but we'll let it go at that, about eliminating the deficit. You know, should we balance the budget in 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, 5 years, 4 years, 12 years, and how much should we cut various programs? Let me tell you a little secret. The debate in Washington is not about deficits. It is not about deficits. It's about direction. It's about direction. If it were about deficits, why would you cut taxes $245 billion and give it to mostly affluent people who don't need it? New York Times says that people earning between 50 and 75 grand will get 69 cents a day because of the tax cut. And at the same time, cut the Earned Income Tax Credit program, which benefits families who are in between $15,000 and $30,000, who are working families. As President Reagan once said, he called it his favorite welfare program because it helped working families. So if it were about deficits, why would you give away $245 billion and at the same time cut programs, cut tax programs that benefit people who are in between 15 and 30? You wouldn't. But it's not about deficits. It's about direction. If it were about deficits, why would you, for the first time in history, increase the military budget above that requested by the Pentagon to the extent of about $35 billion, $7 billion next year? Why would you do that? I mean, why would you give the Pentagon more money than they asked for? And if you know, those of you who are more knowledgeable about the military than I am, I know that if you add up all of the budgets of all of the countries in the world, all of the military budgets of all of the countries in the world, it equals our budget, our military budget. Is there something wrong with this picture? I mean, if it were about deficits, if it were truly about deficits, why would you be doing that? It's not about deficits. It's about direction. If it were about deficits, why would you make deep cuts in Medicaid, Medicare, AFDC, housing programs, child programs, feeding programs, and all of the programs that help vulnerable kids, vulnerable families, vulnerable seniors, and at the same time not touch corporate welfare? Not touch corporate welfare. Kevin Phillips, who's a conservative columnist, the Cato Institute, a conservative think tank, have both indicated that you could easily save $250 billion over the next 7 years by cutting corporate welfare in ways that no one would even feel it. That no one would even feel it. So, is it about deficits? It's not about deficits. It's about direction. The whole argument in Washington is about direction. It's about where are we going in this country. And instead of developing programs that would help people who need to be helped in ways that would make sense, and there's one thing that most people agree upon in Washington, that the programs need to be run by communities and by folks at the local level. There is almost no disagreement about that. The question is, what's the appropriate role of the federal government in assisting local communities, assisting Charlie Baker, assisting the state of Massachusetts, assisting Humboldt County in California to run their programs? And the biggest single thing that is happening that I think is the most unbelievable, which pains me no end, is the elimination of a 60-year federal commitment, a 60-year guarantee to poor children and poor families called the AFDC entitlement, that says that it doesn't make any difference what the color of your skin is, what language you speak, whether I like you or I don't like you. If you qualify by income, you are eligible and guaranteed the federal entitlement for AFDC. And that is about to be eliminated by both Republican and Democrats. And the president should be ashamed of himself if he signs a welfare bill that eliminates the AFDC entitlement. And we are afraid that he might do just that. And then eliminate the entitlement for Medicaid, which is a 30-year commitment, eliminate the entitlement for adoption and foster care assistance for abused and neglected kids, which is a 35-year commitment that we've had. And fortunately, with the help of Senator Chafee from Rhode Island, we might just save that one, which would be an enormous accomplishment in this sea change. So let me just conclude by saying that those of us who work with kids know that the kids who do best are the kids who have good social supports. Kids who do well in school, kids who have strong families, kids who participate in structured youth activities, kids who are involved in a church or synagogue, the kids who have those things in their life, those kids are probably going to do fine, thank you. They're probably going to do well. And instead of investing and making sure that the federal government is the equalizer and helps local communities to provide those kinds of supports, what we've done in this country, and probably the last point I would make, because I think it's the most egregious and the most outrageous, is the singling out of young unmarried women in this country and targeting them, demonizing them, scapegoating them. 7.6% of the AFDC population are families headed by women under the age of 20. You would think that these women caused the war in Iraq, for God's sake. You would think they have been responsible for every terrible thing that's ever happened in the United States of America. We've demonized them and made illegitimacy. It's like it's the end of the world. It's the end of the world. And instead of giving them the supports that they need and playing to their strengths and helping them the way it would make a difference, we've demonized them. So we've got some work to do to turn this around. And it's going to take an enormous effort on the part of a lot of people. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
The question that Julie asked me to talk about was a little less green eye shade than where's the money go. It was more about sort of society's responsibility to kids and how do we think about it and how might we measure whether or not we're living up to it. So given that I got 5 minutes here instead of 50, I thought I might just try a few notions on how I think about this and how I think about whether or not we measure success. I think one of the things that I measure or I pay attention to in terms of our responsibility to kids is, do the kids in our society have parents who have jobs? Because fundamentally one of the major ways kids succeed in life is by seeing their parents succeed, and parents who are succeeding, ultimately that will reflect on the way they deal with their kids and with their community and all the rest. The second is to think that families matter. And to tell you the truth, I happen to believe that that's a fairly recent phenomenon in this country. We went through a fairly long period of time where I don't really think we thought very hard about whether we thought families mattered or not. The third, I would say, is to think about prevention, and to think about prevention in the broadest sense of the word. And in Massachusetts, that means things like very high immunization rates for 2-year-olds and 5-year-olds. The only state in the country that has made WIC and early intervention entitlement programs. Healthy Start, which is a program for women who are not eligible for AFDC, who are poor and pregnant. We also have one of the biggest and broadest and most well-supported community health center systems in the country. I think the next thing is believing in the value of education. There's going to be a big food fight, in my opinion, over the course of the next 15 or 20 years about what the structure and the financing mechanism of K through 12 education is going to be. But the point about whether or not it matters and whether or not it's important, I think, is something that people have gotten over in a big way, and that will certainly be something that people pay a lot of attention to, I think, over the course of the next 10 or 15 years. Protect the public. I think it's really hard for kids to grow up if they're spending all day, or their families are spending all day, or their friends are spending all day worrying about getting shot at. And there is simply no question that there are places in this country and places in this state where a kid takes his chance every time he goes outside. The last piece I would mention here, and those are sort of the macro ones, is to do what we can to protect kids at risk. And that falls into what I guess I would call two pieces, public assistance generally and child welfare in particular. On the final one, child welfare in particular, I can't help but emphasize the role of the courts. I don't think most people pay much attention to the court system in the context of how they think about child welfare. You should get yourselves, if you really want to talk about child welfare, you should get some of the judges in the state's probate district and juvenile courts to come over here and spend some time with you. I am not a big fan of the court system. But it's not all their fault. I mean, part of it is the nature of deliberation. Part of it is the fact that our laws really are not stacked toward kids. They're stacked toward bio parents, even the worst scum of bio parents. And I think one of the big problems that we will face with kids at risk, and will continue to face with kids at risk, is that society has not been able to make up its mind about whose side it's really on when it comes to the point where the rubber meets the road and government has to make a decision. Now, with regard to how we measure some of this stuff, I think everybody would agree that on the economic side, there are definitely more jobs. Wage growth, however, hasn't moved very much at all for a very long time. In real terms, family income is up, but it's mostly up because the hours families work have gone up. And household income is relatively flat, although the size of households has also come down a little. So if you look at it in terms of number of people per household and income per capita in households, the numbers there are better than you might think. But I think the one big secret to the whole kids question is our economy just doesn't deliver for families, and thereby doesn't deliver for kids the way it did 10 or 15 or 20, 25 years ago. The second piece, which I mentioned, which is the family stuff, divorce and separation and single-parent families are far more prevalent and significant now than they were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think the literature is still unclear, at least with regard to divorced kids. It's pretty clear that divorce is bad, but the question about whether divorce is bad for families is something that I think the stuff I've read anyway is still kind of mixed up on. I think the real news there is that people believe that this stuff matters and is important in a way that, again, I don't think they did 10, 20 years ago. On the K through 12 stuff, I mentioned before, this is a big issue. Everybody's going to pay attention to it. But I personally believe that public education generally, in the way it's financed and structured, is in for a very rough, rocky ride for the next 10 or 15 years. I happen to think that's terrific, particularly as the father of a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. I think public education is the last great Politburo. an American government, and it needs a very bad and desperate dose of innovation and new thinking if it's going to be successful in a technology-based economy, particularly a global one. We've made enormous progress and strides on childhood disease. Massachusetts has some of the best records in the country on a wide variety of those topics. The U.S. overall is definitely a land of very good and very bad news on that issue. The crime stuff, the statistics are all down except for juveniles, which are up dramatically. And juvenile crime in certain areas is up by a staggering margin. Again, a case of sort of best and worst of times. The two final things I would comment on, teen pregnancy is not a big part of the AFDC or the child welfare caseloads at any one time. However, more than half of everyone who is on public assistance at any given time had their first child as a teenager, and more than half of everyone who is on the DSS caseload at any given time had their first child as a teenager. Teen pregnancy, in my opinion, is the single biggest social problem that we face. And if we don't figure out how to solve it, it will completely consume and demolish communities, public institutions, private institutions, and the rest. That may sound like demonization, and for that I apologize, but the simple fundamental fact is children born into teen families start with the deck stacked against them in ways that other children simply don't even begin to compare, and that's not just true for the kid, that's true for the mom as well. And the final thing I would say is I think the real issue that we haven't been able to reach public agreement on around how we treat child welfare generally, and I think it's never been part of any legislative or body politic discussion here or anywhere else, is do we really believe in serving the interests of the kids first or not? Because if we did, we would draw much brighter and much cleaner and much clearer lines in the sand about whose interests we are interested in representing, both at a statutory basis and an adjudicatory basis, than we do now. We definitely have historically, both from a legal point of view and a process point of view, chosen to muddy the waters on that one and not to draw a clear line about whose side we think we're on. And I think that is ultimately a big part of the problem in how we think about both dealing with child welfare issues and solving them.
Thank you, John and Ed, and Julie, thank you for inviting me to speak at the Kennedy School.
I hope you'll come back again.
I'll come back some other time again, yeah, sure. Kids in 5 minutes. In some ways I can say what I feel and think right now in just a few words, which is just I'm very, very scared. I'm a, by nature, quite optimistic person. I tend to believe in solutions and so forth, but I think I am as fearful about our future and our kids' future as I've ever been. It's a hard-won lesson, but it's one deeply felt. I guess the first question we're supposed to think about in this 5 minutes is what do we owe our kids, and what are we trying to do? And I actually like the bigger question than the sort of what should we be doing first, although I think it leads there. I think you just sort of start in what you believe in. And it's interesting. Charlie was, I think, very good about talking about, what do we believe in? We ultimately believe in things like family and work and responsibility and opportunity and community. And it seems to me that's the place we ought to start. But if we believe in those things, we certainly got some things to worry about. And here, too, again, I just want to echo what was just said. When you got full-time workers who earn less now than they did 20 years ago on average, the bottom half of the income distribution, there's less. Real wages are going down, and especially for people with anything less than a college degree, you see real wages going down. The American dream it used to be, you work hard and you do well and your kids will do better. Well, we got the first generation where sons on average are earning less than their fathers at the same age. My daughters are earning a little bit more than their mothers, but that's because their mothers weren't working outside the home. It's very troubling. And ultimately, if that work foundation isn't there, if you can't make it working hard, if you're playing by the rules and losing the game, your kids are in trouble. Second part has to do with family. It's been a lot of talk about it. I, too, am very worried about changing family structures, and we certainly have a dramatic change in the number of children in single-parent families. The typical child born in the U.S. will spend time in a single-parent home. It is true many children are born to teen parents. Many more are born to older parents. But it's a really serious problem as well. And you add on top of this everything else from drugs to violence to television and so forth, and it's a scary thing. But suppose we really did believe in family and work and the values we talk about. Suppose we really did and we wanted to do something. What would we be doing? My own window on this, of course, is working on welfare reform, which has been my life's work. Looks like I'm not out of a job just yet, though I might change to studying pensions or something. You sort of say, well, gee, your whole goal is to help people help themselves, to empower families and so forth, and I think you'd have to look at the current system and be pretty discouraged. I'm a real harsh critic, in part because I find welfare recipients are the harshest critics we got. You talk to any welfare recipient about the experience of being on welfare, and they just talk about the stigma, the frustration, and humiliation. We don't reinforce work with welfare. We don't reinforce family. We don't reinforce community. We don't tend to bring people together. We tend to create us versus them. So if you were trying to do the right thing, I think what you do is, first of all, you'd say, okay, look, if I believe in work, I got to make work pay. Now, I'd like to make the economy better, and I ought to work on that. I ought to improve education, I ought to work on that. But in the meantime, I ought to do some things to help working people. Earned income tax credit's been mentioned a couple of times. Seems like a winner. Ronald Reagan said it was the most pro-family, pro-work policy ever invented. It was one of his big policies. It was expanded dramatically the last couple of years. Right now it's on the cutting blocks for reasons that I find quite hard to understand. If you believed in working families, you probably wouldn't design a health system that gave relatively secure health insurance to only two groups, the upper middle income folks and above, and the non-working poor. You might think that might be a bad message to those people who are working hard and not on welfare. You might think that that was an important signal to send somewhere or another. And if you believed in work and you wanted to help single parents especially, but if you wanted to help families in general go to work, you'd probably think that quality child care was something in some way related to that kind of activity. And I'd like to argue, I believe it's true, that in the Clinton welfare bill, all those things was where we started and what we tried to accomplish. I think it also fundamentally changed the welfare system, because the welfare system in reality is not about helping people help themselves. It's about getting them money, which is a perfectly good and honorable thing to do, except that that's not what actually the people even themselves want, primarily. One woman put it to me this way: I've been on and off welfare for 10 years, in and out of the welfare office dozens of times. Never once in that 10 years did anyone ever ask me the first question I expected to be asked. What was that question? What's the problem? How can I help? See, in the welfare business, we're in the eligibility business. We're in the check writing business. We're actually very good at it. Trouble is, we're not in the help yourself business. And when you're in the eligibility and check writing business, what you want to know is, do you have your birth certificates with you? Not, how can I help you get a job? And your ideal client, by the way, Charlie knows this, your ideal client, if you're in the welfare business, in the eligibility and check writing business, is one that has zero income that never changes. The worst client goes to work, gets a job, loses the job, gets their child care, loses their child care, has health. Oh, terrible client, because their income goes up and down. In fact, we even have a name for those cases. This is true, that we call them error-prone cases. Okay? That's work. That is the wrong message. Okay? If you believed in work, you'd invest up front. You'd say to people, I'm going to help you help yourself. I'm going to get you some opportunity. We're going to place you in a job. We'll get you training. We'll get you child care, whatever it is. But the goal is to get you on your feet out of this business. We want to be out of the business. And I think ultimately you would say there does come a point when you're expected to work. Where ultimately, and if you keep, but we would at such a time say, look, we're not going to give you a welfare check anymore. We're going to take that welfare check and make it into a paycheck somehow. That ought to be the goal. All right, so suppose those were your goals, and that seems like a reasonable set of directions to go in. Let me just say where we are, where we're headed. There was a lot of talk about block grants and concern to do things at the local level. Sounds exactly right. No question about it that what we ought to do is do more things at the local level. Giving complete control is a dangerous game for a variety of reasons. But let me just give you two facts that, in many ways, to me, says more about the current welfare reform bill, whether it's really about the things I've just talked about, or whether it's really about the things that were talked about earlier, just cutting the budget. Whether it's really about local control or cutting the budget. Two facts. Think to yourself just for a moment, thought experiment. Suppose I was about all these things and I wanted to think about a block grant that's going to, or a couple of block grants that are going to be about how much do you need for cash assistance when people are poor, even if it's temporary, work and training, and child care. How much do I need per poor child, let's say? Think about that number, and then let me tell you what the number is for a number of southern states. The number is $10 a week. That's what the block grant is for child care, work and training, and AFDC, $10 a week. Okay, of course, that's not true in all states. It's only the southern states. Only the poor states get that much. Some of the states get as much as $40 or $45 per poor child per week. Now, you can say that's about work. You can say that's about helping people help themselves. And you certainly don't want to say it's about money primarily. But really, when you try and think about what you're going to accomplish for that, what you're asking, is that going to transform this welfare system regardless of what rules you say? The other, and by the way, that's a cut of about 15 to 20% from current law. The House bill took this to new heights, I thought, where they said 1 million people have to work and we ought to cut child care by 20% from current law. Again, I tried, let me see, more people working, less child care. I get it, yeah. If you're serious about helping kids, if you're serious about helping people help themselves, you do have to change the present system. It's broken, bad. But you also can't pretend that it's free or that simple promises or simple truisms about family or family structure or the economy or local control or whatever else is going to do it all. You got to make it possible for states to do what you're asking them to do. States cannot do the impossible. They can't place lots of people with no resources and no help and cuts all over the place. And so they'll do what is possible. What is possible if you're a state is to cut your benefits, or better yet, instead of moving people from welfare to work, how about moving them from welfare to the state line? And then you have a race to the bottom, and we can see some adverse things. The only other fact, and I'm gone on too long, but then everybody else did, and I'm a professor. Thank God. One other fact, estimates by OMB, HHS Treasury, were that the House bill would create 2 million more poor children, and the new and improved Senate bill would only create 1 million more poor children. Welfare reform, $10 a week, 1 to 2 million more poor children. Is that moving us in the right direction? And I think ultimately the question is, okay, we believe in values. We believe that a lot of what government's done is wrong. We think the federal government's it's too rigid and all those things. I think all those things are true. But let's also remember that in the end, we're going to have to do something real, or our children will really be in real trouble in 5 years. In the meantime, all of you, I want to say that many of you here, you're clearly remarkably committed to come out in this weather, truly bizarre behavior. It's going to be twice as hard as ever before. It's going to be twice as important as ever before, and it doesn't matter. I mean, every one of us will pick ourselves up and go forward and do it again because it's all we got. And so the only other thing I would say is, just as a private citizen and as a professor who gets to sit around and think grand thoughts and twiddle his thumbs and so forth, I just want to say thank you for all your hard work, because I know it's hard work and it's going to get tougher, but it's the most important job we got. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It is a real honor, and I hope it will be a pleasure for you more than for me. What do we owe our children? Well, whatever it is we owe them, we're giving it to them less and less. And that's for certain. I share David's pessimism looking at the future. I also actually do see some good things which also give me hope. But if we continue on the general direction we're going as a nation, we're looking to meltdown. Meltdown. We are at 31% out of wedlock birth rates now. The proportions between married families and single-parent families is changing. The proportion of intact, always married families is dropping relative to the whole. Now, I'm not against any person or any child born out of wedlock. Every single one of them we ought to embrace. Every mother who gives birth to such a child, to me, is a hero, given some of the other options that are in front of her. But that still does not take away from the fact that as a group, we are really damaging those children. Now let me go right to where I think the nub of where it goes wrong. Look, we're really going wrong on the basics, the fundamentals. When the game is this messed up, when a company is facing bankruptcy, some of the basics have gone wrong in a company. As a nation, we have gone wrong on the basics. And actually, the basic one, and all the data leads me this way, but nobody is, well, I doubt Harvard is studying it. I hope they are, but I doubt it. So let me propose a new area of study, a new institute. It is on the relationship between the sexual act and the future of the country. Because it is in the sexual act that the child begins his existence or her existence. And right at that moment, a huge amount of the future of that child is already set in place. And how we as a nation regard that sexual act essentially embodies a lot of where we're heading for the future, because it's in that moment that the next nation is made. If the child is conceived and born out of wedlock, their health is going to be less than those right at birth. Their neonatal mortality rate is much higher. The neonatal mortality rate for white, educated, college graduate women is higher than it is for married grade school dropouts. That's the effect that this relational aspect has on the physical health of a child. Their cognitive development is less, no matter what socioeconomic strata they're born in. They perform less at school. The average difference, by the way, between a child born in an intact family and in a broken family in their early 30s, the average national difference on their income is $11,500 a year. They're more prone to addictions. Crime rate is higher. Out-of-wedlock birth rates are higher. Like the drug problem, where does it come from? Look, the kid who has an empty or broken heart is at risk for drugs. Where does the empty and broken heart come from? From a home that's not nurturing enough. Now, look, all of this is, in a sense, at the pre-stage. I know most of you are involved, as I used to be, on the front line in the emergency room where you have to help the child or the parent. And that's not to take away at all, actually. We'll have to be doing more and more of this. Just given what we're putting in place, we're going to have a massive expanding need for all the services that everybody has talked about. More EITC, more drug programs, more learning, boosting the learning at school, more counseling, more everything. On the other hand, we will have less and less people who will be productive enough to produce the taxes which can support this. We're pushing this up and we're pulling this down. This is why I see meltdown. It's very serious. Now, where we have to head, we have to set ourselves the goal of we honor everybody. But we've got to put right back up as a national, societal, cultural goal that our family lives are intact family lives. I used to be a marriage therapist. Marriage, family, and kids. I dealt a lot with them. Because of my religious convictions, I would never help somebody see their marriage break up. They all knew that. I said, look, I'm in here to help you make it. If you really want to divorce, you make that decision. I'm not going to push that one. Of all the couples I ever helped, nobody ever divorced. Now, there was selection in that. The worst cases probably never came to me and all the rest. There's a whole lot of other stuff. But when I put myself next to the therapist, I was one of the very few who thought that way. I just throw that out as a vignette. It is not social science data. But to me, it is very compelling. Most marriages can be saved. Most couples break up, not because the wife is being abused. They break up just because it's over. It's not good enough. I don't believe that we believe in family. We don't believe in marriage. Our tax codes don't believe in marriage. Our courts don't believe in marriage. Our schools don't believe in marriage. None of these things are taught. Now, why do I concentrate on that? Because that's where we'll keep spawning more and more and more damaged kids. So the talk about all the needed services, and I agree with every single point everybody has made here. There's not one David's points I don't disagree with. I might on his characterization of politics in Washington. We'd both characterize that very differently. But on the services and the needs for kids, that's there. But we are fooling ourselves if we don't address the other problem. And what's more, we're damaging the kids who are going to be born next year. If we don't set about this now, there'll be more of these children born next year, more the year after, more the year after, more the year after. Let me end with what I think has got to inform services. If you give the changes taking place in the funding, I think it's a good step to get the feds out. We need the federal money. You don't need the federal regulations. When you get it down to the states, then it'll be a good thing to get the state capitals out of it. You need the state money. You don't need the state regulations. Okay, then you get it down to the local. Now, sure, there's a danger there. There's lack of control. But in these issues, actually, control is what vitiates. You don't want control. You have dedicated people. They know how to make it work. And it will be different. It cannot be controlled. You look at any program that works, any therapist, any counselor, any service person, every way that good helpers help individuals is unique to them and very different. I used to be in ASPE, actually. If David had been in the Bush administration or I had been in the Clinton administration, he would have been my boss. When I was in ASPE, I got 10 of the staff to look through the evaluation data because I wanted to identify social programs, not material health programs, social programs that are working. Because I thought, now, if we can identify 3 or 4 or whatever it is, we can sort of isolate the good variables, the good things that are happening, and start getting that out there into the debate. We could not identify one. Some people said Head Start. Head Start's a very controversial area. Anybody who's looked at it, you can go. So I said, leave that aside because President Bush was pushing that and I wanted to keep my job. What else is working? Nothing else. Nothing else was there on the social program side. Now, are there social programs working around the country? Of course there are. And they depend on the unique talents. The talent and temperament of leaders and of workers make all the difference. Elaine Bennett, Bill Bennett's wife, has a phenomenal program going in the inner city, southeast Washington, to reduce teen pregnancy. It's called Best Friends. She had about 600 grade school, middle school girls go through it. Right now, demographically, she's been told she should have had about 140 pregnancies among those girls. She's had 3. It's working. Now, by counterpart, over in Watts, Los Angeles, there's another lady, a big, fat, African-American mama, the quintessential, big-hearted lady who's taking great care of girls in Watts, Los Angeles, trying to keep them from getting pregnant. And she's having similar success rates. But how does she do it? Totally different. She's got scholarships to Hawaii. 2 weeks in Hawaii. It motivates, it works. Now, I use this to illustrate the 2 totally different talents and temperaments of Elaine Bennett and this lady. You could not programmatize that from the top. We've got to look to ways to tap into the inspiration and the flexibility. We have to leave the flexibility there because not only are the needs different, the talents and the way that people work best in addressing the needs are also different. If we provide work and if we have stable marriage, and if those two are our goals, then the only children we really have to look after are those whom the parents we judge are unfit parents. And then we can remove those children as fast as possible. Now, obviously, there's a gray area in here, but I'm talking about the goals. Get those three elements very clear, then we can move ahead, and we can reduce the load a huge amount. Thank you.
I don't think there's any disagreement about 15-year-olds having babies. Nobody wants 15-year-olds to have babies. Anybody that did would not be in the real world. And nobody disagrees that kids who are born of young unmarried moms have a lot working against them. So there's agreement on that. Is it better to have two parents than one? Absolutely. There's single-parent families that do a phenomenal job? Absolutely. The question is, what do you do about it? I mean, I hear all of this talk about, reducing illegitimacy, and I hate the word because I agree with Patrick, all kids are legitimate, and it's a bad use of a word. But you hear the rhetoric, it's this, and I talk about it as demonizing because it's all aimed at the young women, and it's almost like blame the victims. It's like the young women are the ones that are somehow responsible for this, and if they would only stop having sex, then of course we would not have the problem. So what do? What's being proposed is that we cut benefits. That the way you deal with young unmarried moms is you reduce, you do a family cap. If you're on welfare and you have another kid, you can't get the additional benefit for the additional child. Now, Patrick, let me ask you something. If you believe that in Mississippi, a young woman who's 18 or 19, who's on AFDC and has one child, and she's thinking about, when she has sex, she's thinking about the $10 extra a month she's going to get in Mississippi for that additional child, and that's going to drive her decision to have sex that evening, or in New Jersey, $60 additional a month, then you do believe in the tooth fairy. And what happened is that the state...
I believe neither things.
Okay, I don't think that...
But the state of New Jersey implements the family cap, and 3 years later, there is a study that comes out from Rutgers University that says New Jersey welfare cap has no effect on births. Surprise, surprise, like we didn't know that. And meanwhile, 15 states have enacted the family cap, okay, as a way of trying to control births. The other thing we're doing is withholding cash benefits. We'll provide diapers, but we won't provide cash benefits, like somehow that's going to have some impact. The solutions to the problem are just outrageous. They're outrageous. If you were serious about doing something about the problem, you would not do it the way we're trying to do it. You would do it the way that David suggested and the way that the welfare bill that he designed tried to attack that problem by providing some of the supports, by targeting high-risk groups, and by figuring out how you could do certain things that would reduce unwed births. Let me just say one other thing, and then I'll stop. And it has to do with the demonization. Here's the Heritage Foundation Bible. America's failed $5.4 trillion war on poverty. Every time I met with a member of the Ways and Means Committee during the welfare debate on the House side, or met with people in Congress of particular persuasion, this was the Bible. Do you know, David, over the last 30 years, we have spent $5.4 trillion on the war on poverty. And look where we are. You guys have had it your way for the last 30 years. And look where we are. We're going to try it our way. Let me just read something. A sweeping overhaul of the failed welfare system is required to reverse the trend of the past 25 years, reduce illegitimacy and promote the formation of two-parent families, demand that welfare recipients contribute something back to their society, firmly control serving wealth. It's all about welfare, right? $5.4 trillion. Do you know how much of this actually went for AFDC? how much of the $5.4 trillion actually went for AFDC? Does anybody in the room know? I know. Does anybody know?
I think you're going to.
450 billion of the 5.4 trillion over 30 years actually went for AFDC. Half of this money, half of the 5.4 trillion war on poverty was for health care, mostly for senior citizens. 65% of the money went to the elderly and disabled. You want to cut I suppose you want to kick people out of nursing homes.
Stop.
No, I know, but here's the point I'm making. This is the demonizing of people on welfare. This is a lie. I'm not accusing you of lying, Patrick, because you wouldn't do that. But this is the big lie. This is the big lie, and this is what's being sold to the American people, and it's absolute nonsense. Let me just tell you what 450 billion is. 450 billion over 30 years. Over 30 years that we've spent on AFDC equals, last point, equals the net worth of the wealthiest 400 people in the United States of America. That's what 450 billion over 30 years equals.
Seems to me that a surprising amount of consensus came out of this group, and so I'd like to push a couple of questions and then open it up to the group. One, I think, is everyone on this panel, for a variety of reasons that are quite different, is very concerned about what's likely to happen to children in the future in the absence of any changes. And I think the second thing that came through is through our actions, and in some cases through our rhetoric, it is clear that this country does not value children or is ambivalent about the value it places on children. So let me start out with a political question, which is, how do we put the issue of children front and center and focus on and force the questions about how we value children? You want to start, Patrick?
Well, I would disagree with your question.
Okay, that's a fair enough place
I
to
would
start.
say, until we put marriage front and center, we devalue children. And that's really it. At the moment the child is conceived, the child has the right at that time to the love of both the mother and the father for that child, himself or herself, and between the parents because of the effect the lack of that has on the child.
Then how do we put marriage and families front and center?
The biggest, well, one thing I think, like in a practical sense, and one of the reasons, and by the way, I use the term illegitimate, by the way, it is of the act. It is culturally an illegitimate act to bring a child into the world if both the father and the mother are not prepared, ready, contracted to take care of that child to the adulthood. To me, that is an illegitimate, evil act. The people aren't evil. The child is not evil. Well, the people are to the extent they're doing the act. The consequences on society are massive. It is an illegal act. One of the things I think practically to begin to pull the debate back here is just to lay the data out. Look, if you want children to thrive, look at the data. Where do they thrive? They thrive in stable, happy, married families. Then you say, now, you thought that was right-wing stuff. Next step. Where do stable, happy, married families tend to come from? Not solely, but mainly. Mainly, they are church-going, church-believing families. Look at the data. Look at the effect that church-going has on all the problems we're concerned about. There was a magnificent study came out of the National Economic Research Institute, or NIRB, the one that's based here in Washington. Came out in the mid-'80s, mid to 86 or thereabouts, on the effect on kids who make it out of inner city poverty. Church-going kids make it out. Now, when I read that piece of data, it jumped off the charts at me. Has there been a replication since? No. you see, there are things which are politically incorrect, which ought not to be, which academically ought to be driving us. When we find things that really work, to me, these are the things we put up front. If you want to look at, now, I'm not totally against imposing religion on anybody. By its very nature, it's a free act. If you try and impose it, it's no longer religion. It's some other garbage. But first I'd say, look at the damage done to children and look at the health of children. We've got to get that out front. We've got to gradually turn people around. Mm-hmm. And you've got to look at what works. What builds up marriage? I think actually abstinence has got to return, like sex education, teaching kids how to use condoms is crazy. When I was a teenager, if I was taught how to use a condom, it wouldn't have taken long till I was using a condom. And if I was using a condom, on average, some of the time it was going to fail, and I would be fathering kids out of wedlock. And the more you do that, the more kids out of wedlock you have. And if you do that, you vitiate the whole idea of marriage. So that's a very practical thing. On that, how do you begin to return that? I think you put parents back in control of schools. I've given enough ideas.
David or Charlie, you want to jump in on that one?
I just want to say two things. One is, I think this talking about the data question is a lot more important than a lot of other people do, and that's because I'm one of these folks who actually believes that what gets said in academia ultimately gets said on the street. It takes a while to get there, but these are the places that define the nature and the scope of the way public opinion develops around issues. Anybody who thinks that Michael Harrington's book didn't have a lot to do with the 1960s doesn't understand what they're talking about any more than someone who doesn't think Charlie Murray's book didn't have a lot to do with the 1980s and the 1990s. There is not a single newspaper, television station, radio station in the United States of any major size that's not specifically in the business of promoting religion that has a beat religion writer. We have sports pages, we have business pages, we have Metro Region, we have, North Weekly, we have South Weekly. More people go to church every Sunday in Massachusetts than attend Patriots games all year. But there is no real attention applied by society, the body politic, whatever, to the role of religion in anything. And it matters. I mean, that was the one place I would disagree with Patrick, is I do think people think about religion in ways now that they didn't 10 or 15 years ago, just as I think they think about families. I mean, the New York Times, for example, has published an enormous amount of literature on families in the last couple of years. And every time I see it, I jump for joy, because the Times is one of the places that drives a lot of other media. Now, is the Times going to make everybody who's interested in this issue happy? Probably not. But they talk about it a lot more than they ever used to. And I do think that part of the problem that we face on all of these issues is people don't, this guy, for example, him, Dutch Leonard, there are a few others who are real exceptions to the rule in terms of how they view the disposition and development of data and information. They're willing to have a personal point of view, but they don't try and make the data bend to satisfy whatever their particular point of view is. And frankly, they don't get the kind of, what they do doesn't get the kind of distribution that it should. The stuff that usually gets distributed is the stuff that's developed and promoted by somebody who's got a particular angle, because that's where the money and the juice is that can support that information. But I do think, the data debate just isn't where it should be, and that's a very frustrating thing for somebody like me who spent 3 years in a public policy research institute and 5 years now in state government. And I used to joke about the fact that I've been in state government for 5 years. I haven't had a big thought since I showed up, and I think this is a big problem.
You keep getting promoted too.
I'm going to ask Charlie one more question, but before I do, I want to say we're going to take questions from the audience. The strategy is line up behind the mics, and we'll alternate from mic to mic. Say who you are and ask your question. Charlie, what kind of data do you want?
I guess the data I want most is data about longitudinal analyses of what happens to kids and families. I mean, the thing that made his work in particular, not to come back to him, on public assistance so valuable was he actually tried to do a longitudinal analysis of what happens to kids and families on public assistance. Snapshots are nice, but no one in the private sector, no one in the academic arena who manages and runs universities makes policies on snapshots. We love to make policy on snapshots in government, and it is so stupid. You should never make policy on a snapshot, because you'll be wrong most of the time. And we don't have the kind of information on a longitudinal basis that people who spend the kind of money that we spend on this stuff and who have the profoundly positive and negative impact on people's lives that we do to make the kinds of decisions that we make. So I would say the thing we need more than anything is people who are willing to dig in and do real hard, big time, large group sampling analysis, control group and otherwise, over a long-term basis to inform public policy, because that's where you're going to get the kind of information that can actually be incorporated into the way we think about what we do.
David, do you want to?
I think I started out my talk by saying I was very worried about our children, and I'm still very worried about our children. Perhaps more so than I was even half an hour ago. Look, yes, it's about religion, and yes, it's about data, and yes, it's about family, and yes, it's about work, but it's ultimately about solutions. And I want to go on record that I too favor religion, and that I too am against teen pregnancy. But I haven't heard, and I'm really in favor of data. Really, go for that, boy. And I admit we don't have enough. And investing in the Kennedy School would be a good place to start. Those of you that do have a checkbook at hand. But ultimately, we got to try some stuff, and we got to do some stuff, and we got to learn from some stuff. And we know a lot more than we pretend. And as I said before, look, if you're serious about helping kids, Pat, you were asked for solutions, and I didn't hear any. I heard religion. That's not a solution. That's a correlate. Yes, I'd like people to be more moral in our country, or religious, or whatever else it is. Abstinent also. I'd like happier marriages. I'd like husbands and wives to pay closer attention to each other. I'd like Hollywood producers to produce more appropriate movies and all those things. But really, our kids are in trouble. And there are some ideas, there are some thoughts, there's some directions. And it isn't just about cutting the budget or changing the level of government that's involved. And if we're serious, and if we don't believe in one approach, then let's try several. But let's look at it carefully, and let's learn. And I guess what I find frustrating about this discussion is, the lack of really concrete stuff. What we've heard is family caps don't work. I mean, I actually think that there are good and legitimate reasons why some people might believe not paying additional benefits for additional children was a sensible or moral or appropriate thing to do. It turned out it didn't work, and so maybe that was a mistake. But at least we learned something from it. And so my hope would be, as we struggle through it, and I think a challenge for all of us, the Kennedy School, everywhere else, is to get beyond the rhetoric about to start with values and then go beyond it. But the only other thing I would just say is, if we don't start by talking about values, which everyone has done, I think we lose the debate. I think just saying, gee, our kids are in trouble, therefore spend more on X program, that's a loser. If we say, I believe in work, I believe in family, and these are the things I would like to say will help work and will help families, what are your alternatives? That, I think, is not necessarily a winning argument, but is less likely to be a losing argument.
I'm Alice Johnson from the state of Minnesota, and I share all of your concern about our children.
I'm from Minnesota, too, that's why.
Right, I know that. First of all, I want to say that in case all of you fine gentlemen don't know, women don't have babies. Men and women have babies. And And I'm always appalled, and I'm asking, I guess, for a response and a promise from you that whenever any of you speak in public, because you have the ability to influence people, that you will talk about the irresponsible fathers. And maybe we should set up at the Kennedy School a study for male responsibility in terms of impregnating young women. I was appalled when I heard from, I believe it was Marian Wright Edelman, and I'm not absolutely certain, but I can gather the information for you if you desire me to, that when she told me that women are impregnated by males 6 years older than themselves, I started thinking, okay, now a 13-year-old girl gets pregnant, that means that's a 19-year-old man. And who do we focus on? The 13-year-old girl? And I thought, my goodness gracious, I'm the parent of 4 children. Now, why aren't we talking about the males? And that's my question.
I think you're right on the money. I think you're absolutely right. It's a great point, and the figure you gave is absolutely right. The young women who are between 15 and 17, the men are 5 years older on average. The young women who are younger, the men are 7 years older on average. And we lose sight of that. We absolutely lose sight of that. And we don't have very many good programs that are aimed at the dads. We really don't. And in lots of ways, we force the dads away because of all the child support. You know, the child support issue is a huge one. And if you've worked with the dads, and I have, if you work with a lot of the dads, I mean, they pull back because the only time anybody wants to engage them is around the child support issue.
I have one suggestion, and it's one that I have proposed in my state of Minnesota, that any man who impregnates a woman who's on welfare be sterilized.
A little harsh, but
Can I just
Certainly a
Patrick's a little more
strong
enthused.
incentive.
just say one thing? 5 minutes is a short time, but in the Clinton welfare reform, at least half of it was on child support enforcement, ranging from in-hospital paternity to a variety of things to make sure that across state lines and so forth, people are involved. But it's true. There's another point, though. You know, parents, we ought to ask both parents to help nurture and provide for the child. And I think child support enforcement can be seen only as a stick. And in some sense, anything we expect of the mother, we ought to expect of the father. And anything we offer to the mother, at some level, we ought to be willing to offer the father. And so, in fact, in the Clinton bill, little nose provision was that 10% of the monies available for work and training and other programs were available for non-custodial parents, usually the men, as well. And I couldn't agree more. By the way, the only bit of good news in the current welfare reform debate, and boy, it's little and far between, is in fact that all the bills have some superb new child support enforcement things. They basically are all the same as the Clinton bill. They basically were taken, enough language was changed, but to make it different. But the basic idea is the same. And I really think that one of the few good signs that we're going to see, I think we will see much more in the way of support by single parents, by non-custodial parents to the custodial parents. I also think, and here's something that is getting lost more, though, there was also a fair amount of attempt about how to involve the father more. It's not easy to do. Not all the mothers want the fathers involved. Often they don't. But I do think that finding a way to have both parents involved in nurturing and providing is ultimately essential. And by the way, one other final point on that score, you know, the one thing we've never tried is, in fact, being serious about the fathers. If you parent a child out of wedlock, the odds that you'll ever pay any child support are very low indeed. And so, in that sense, I guess I disagree with David a little bit. I think the answer is not going after the fathers. I think it's rather having high expectations for both parents.
I'm Susan Egmont. Mr. Baker, you said one of the things we should be thinking about is prevention. In Massachusetts, there are 150,000 children without any health insurance, yet we know that $1 spent on preventive health care saves $3 later on and $6 in hospitalization. The Children's Medical Security Program, our state program to provide health insurance for children without it, is only budgeted to cover 18,000 of the 150,000 children. How can we see more state dollars focused on an area where very few dollars will yield very big results in terms of prevention?
The Massachusetts has probably one of the largest and broadest and most significant state-funded safety nets for kids in the United States in health programming. Between its support for some of the programs I mentioned before, plus the work that's done by the Children's Medical Security Plan, plus the eligibility criteria under Medicaid, plus a whole number of other things, we're as far along on making sure that kids have access, particularly to some of the preventive stuff that they need, as anybody is. I think the big problem Massachusetts faces is similar to a problem that a lot of other states face, which is the debate on health care at the national level ended last year, but the significant sort of structural problems that were part of the system at that point in time didn't go away. And in fact, as someone who's not really much of a supporter of an employer-based system, for all the regressive reasons that David mentioned earlier, I don't think they're going to get better anytime soon, and in fact I think they're probably going to get worse. The problem states face is virtually 60 to 70%, I might even say 80% of all of the major issues that affect the way the healthcare system is financed and delivered are driven by federal policy and not by state policy or state law. And it's frankly, I mean, we've proposed a waiver that was sort of designed to fit and fill a whole series of gaps associated with that, which is currently before the legislature, which would have got a significant portion of the kids under 200% of poverty into the system, either through their employers or through the Medicaid program. But it looked jury-rigged, which it was, because it's a very hard problem to fix at the state level. One thing I would say about the child support stuff, Massachusetts has done as much as anybody has in child support enforcement. And we have a terrific paternity identification enforcement and establishment rate at the hospital site, higher than any other state in the United States. But we really need some federal help in this area because there's a limit to how hard you can chase people to live up to their obligations and responsibilities if you're limited by state lines and state geography. But I couldn't agree more with the fact that we should have extraordinarily high expectations for both parents.
Hi, my name is Ismail, and I work for an organization called City Year here in Boston. A couple of comments I want to make is my mother basically raised me by herself. There were a couple of men floating in and out of her life, but she raised me by herself. And if you look at me, I'm a little disheveled. I've got paint on my pants, but I work 50 hours a week for $92.32 after taxes to make my communities a better place. That's a commitment I make myself, and I don't expect everyone to make that commitment here. But what, in the context of what we're talking about, what can people in this room do, aside for just voting, aside for just writing to elected officials? What can they do if they want to get up tomorrow morning and make a difference and start to change what's going on in our communities?
I've been a big brother to the same boy since 1975, okay? He was not in the public schools when I met him. He'd been expelled. He was 11 years old, never to be allowed back again. 5 years later, after a lot of work, I got him and his brother both back into the public school system, and they both eventually graduated from high school. John went on to graduate summa cum laude from Northeastern University after going to school nights for 8 years. He's married. His wife is expecting a child, and I was best man at his wedding 4 years ago. There's no organization, in my opinion, that makes a bigger difference in the lives of kids than any of the mentoring programs that exist in the city of Boston or anywhere in any city in this country. And I'm telling you, there's nothing that makes a bigger difference in the life of a child than having an adult who cares about them just because of who they are and not because they're a member of their caseload or somebody like that. So the thing I would say to everybody is if you don't do any work with a mentoring organization, you ought to go find one and do some because they make a big difference.
I would add a second. I would add a second.
Good for you.
Yeah, I would second that and say good for you and good for Charlie and good for everyone in this room that works with individual kids and that works in agencies that work with kids, that does it as a volunteer, that does it as a paid professional. I think that is phenomenal, and that is something that we all can do personally and that we should do. At the same time, I do think that we all have a responsibility to become engaged in the political discussion that's taking place in this country. When the woman over there talked about prevention, she probably does not know, she might, that the Medicaid program is going to be cut, if the Congress has its way, $170 billion over the next 7 years, which means that Charlie and his colleagues in Massachusetts are going to get less money from the federal government to provide the kinds of programs that you support. And this is the way it plays out. When you eliminate the entitlement for Medicaid, so you eliminate the guarantee, what happens is, in good times, Massachusetts has always been a relatively generous state. And in good times, when they have a surplus and when they have decent people who are running the government, they'll probably do their best to try to support people and services. But in bad times, when the unemployment goes up, when they have big deficits, and I lived through huge deficits in this state when I was in the government in the 70s, what happens is you're looking for places to cut. And when you don't have the entitlement, when you don't have that entitlement, here's what you're going to see across the country. It's going to be unbelievable, and we need to participate in this. You're going to see representatives of senior groups fighting representatives of kids groups. You're going to see nursing homes fighting for the health care dollars against programs for treatment programs for young people. You're going to see warfare among the groups that get the help because there's no entitlement, there's no guarantee. It's up to Charlie and his colleagues and others across the country to make those kinds of political decisions about how they're going to spend the money. And that's why we need to be engaged in this debate, because I don't think that's going to work real well.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. I just want to, in the spirit, Professor Elwood, of constructive engagement, I had some concerns raised for me, Mr. Fagan, when you gave your last little bit about family and church and how these are the fundamental principles that we've got to get back to. I think from an intellectual perspective, we've got to remember some of the history of what happened to our family system. We have to remember that back in the 50s and 60s, families were imbalanced. The balance in power between men and women was unequal, and it was very oppressive. And our churches were an institution there, and we have to remember that. Because I remember the day that my family presented itself, minus my father, to the church, and the pastor wouldn't let my family through that church door because my father wasn't there. He was recovering from his drunk the night before. That pastor who refused to allow my family in that church also knew, I found out years later, what I knew then, which was he had also, like every other night the last year, beaten my mother the night before. He actively counseled my mother against leaving my father. It took my brother and I, when I was 12 and he 15, to remove him physically from our household in order to stop the abuse. You dismissed the abuse a little earlier. And I think we've got to understand these things all come from real places. And yes, family and church are foundations in our society. And I think both family and church have done a lot to right themselves from the problems that helped to create the culture and climate that challenged these institutions. We all grow. But we can't forget those chronic imbalances in some of the institutional structures that created some of these changes. I just encourage you to think about that.
Well, while I'm not sure whether you're for family and for church or against family and against church, but let me, because there's there's like a put down in your comment. That's why I say that. Now look, there is no institution, no earthly institution, nothing that any individuals are connected with that is perfect. I'm talking here about where the competence lies. We've got 5 basic institutions. 3 of them are nurturant, 2 of them are instrumental. The 3 nurturant institutions are family, church, and school. They help people develop. They develop the inner capacities of people. Government exercises power for the common good, and the marketplace does the trading and all the rest to make sure the material goods are there. When you ask one of the institutions to do the work of the other, you screw it up. Government can't run marketplaces. Marketplaces can't run government. Government can't do the work of church. Church can't do the work of government. Government definitely can't do the work of family. Neither can family do the work of government. We've got to get those, they're the basics. Now, every one of those institutions through history has screwed it up because there have always been people who do less than they ought to. Not here at all to defend evils. We've got to get very clear on those basics. And, you know, I brought up family a couple of times, and Dr. Elwood, I'm going to challenge you because you did it gently, but let me bring it to the open. On these issues of forming the capacities of people, you're really talking about forming the inner part of the person. Now, there are needs, there are massive material needs when you do that. You need hospitals, you need schools, you need, all these organizations need buildings, you need salaries. But ultimately, none of those things form the inner capacities. These inner capacities are what I call the spiritual dimension. The spirit of man, the intellect, the will, the habits, the affections, the dispositions, the attitudes. Now that spiritual dimension is caused, I'd put not correlate, caused at the spiritual level, which is fed at the religious level. So it's not a correlate, it's much more than that. So that if you want to get down to really addressing, now this doesn't answer, but let me go from there to the very practical on the programmatic level. One of the people who would be very interesting to get here is Bob Woodson, whom you may have heard of, the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise in Washington. Bob Woodson used to be an inner city social worker in Philadelphia, involved in things, and he became sort of not terribly enamored of what was happening. So he moved out. He was at the American Enterprise Institute for a while. And he's taken on the task of identifying grassroots groups at the local level in poor neighborhoods where the people themselves are solving their own problems. That's like his work. He doesn't do it. He identifies. He's like an impresario then. He makes it known and he shares that information with other inner city groups and poor groups and rural groups and all the rest. If you get together with him, well, what he found after a while is that every single one of those groups are doing great stuff. Kimmy Gray was one. She's the lady who down in Washington, D.C. sort of organized all the tenants, and they started taking over their own public housing block. They started tutoring their kids. That's like a quintessential one. Another one was Freddie Garcia, who's down in Dallas, Texas, working on long-term heroin addicts. He was one himself. Talk about the drug problem. One of the most successful guys in the whole of the South. He's doing it. What he noticed after a while is every single one of those leaders of those groups is a deeply spiritual, prayerful person. Bob Woodson was quite affected. He wasn't a spiritual, prayerful guy. He wasn't looking for this, but he noticed it. It's just there. It's causal. The capacities of people. By the way, if you look at the whole thing, I think something that's gradually dawned on me, what makes anybody grow on this level is talk, conversation, back and forth. Kids need it if they get it. They thrive. That's really what a good education is. That's how companies grow. It's the medium of talk. Because that's how the people really share. Now, by the way, that's the very same thing actually that happens in religion, in prayer. It's the very same thing. It's extended to the spiritual level, and it feeds back and out. These things are deeply connected with really helping our children. They're not everything. The money has to be there, the services have to be there. But if we leave them out, we've left the heart and soul of it out. If we try and construct the skeleton without putting in the heart and the soul, you won't get a body that functions very well.
I'd like to thank our panel. I think Patrick ended on a note that's important for all of us to remember, and that is that conversation is important. I think I would think of this discussion tonight as an opening conversation. We've The panel has expressed reasons for hope, but also reasons for despair and fear for the future of our children. I think we've all been reminded again that the problems are complex, that there's no single solution, and we encourage all of you to do some hard thinking about these problems, and our thanks again to the RFK Action Corps for making this evening possible.